Welcome to East and West, Season 4, an audiobook presentation of Undine by Friedrich de la Motte Fouqué. If you are joining us for the first time, I strongly advise starting Season 4 at the beginning with Season 4, Episode 1. Today's episode is Undine Chapter 3. Now backing up a little, in Chapter 2 we learned how the knight Huldbrand came to be in the haunted forest and all the dangers he met there, spirits and goblins and a recurring image of this fearfully large apparition, this white man. We also gathered that his quest began at the prompting of a lady, Bertalda. Undine's jealousy against Bertalda is clear. To complicate matters, the flooded stream has turned the old fisherman's peninsula into an island, trapping Huldbrand, at least for the time being, with Undine and her adoptive parents. And now, for Undine, Chapter 3. Chapter 3. It may have happened to thee, my dear reader, after being much driven to and fro in the world, to reach at length a spot where all was well with thee. The love of home and of its peaceful joys, innate to all, again sprang up in thy heart. Thou thoughtest that thy home was decked with all the flowers of childhood, and of that purest, deepest love which had grown upon the graves of thy beloved, and that here it was good to live and to build houses. Even if thou didst err, and hast had bitterly to mourn thy error, it is nothing to my purpose, and thou thyself wilt not like to dwell on the sad recollection. But recall those unspeakably sweet feelings, that angelic greeting of peace, and thou wilt be able to understand what was the happiness of the knight Huldbrand during his abode on that narrow slip of land. He frequently observed with heartfelt satisfaction that the forest stream continued every day to swell and roll on with a more impetuous sweep, and this forced him to prolong his stay on the island. Part of the day he wandered about with an old crossbow, which he found in a corner of the cottage and had repaired in order to shoot the waterfowl that flew over. And all that he was lucky enough to hit he brought home for a good roast in the kitchen. When he came in with his catch, Undine seldom failed to greet him with a scolding, because he had cruelly deprived the happy, joyous little creatures of life as they were sporting above in the blue ocean of the air. Nay, more, she often wept bitterly when she viewed the waterfowl dead in his hand. But at other times, when he returned without having shot any, she gave him a scolding equally serious, since, owing to his carelessness and want of skill, they must now put up with a dinner of fish. Her playing taunts ever touched his heart with delight, the more so as she generally strove to make up for her pretended ill humor with endearing caresses. The old people saw with pleasure this familiarity of Undine and Huldbrand. They looked upon them as betrothed, or even as married, and living with them in their old age on their island, now torn off from the mainland. The loneliness of his situation strongly impressed also the young Huldbrand, with the feeling that he was already Undine's bridegroom. It seemed to him as if, beyond those encompassing floods, there were no other world in existence, or at any rate as if he could never cross them, and again associate with the world of other men. And when at times his grazing steed raised his head and neighed to him, seemingly inquiring after his knightly achievements and reminding him of them, or when his coat of arms sternly shone upon him from the embroidery of his saddle and the caparisons of his horse, or when his sword happened to fall from the nail on which it was hanging in the cottage, and flashed on his eye as it slipped from the scabbard in its fall, he quieted the doubts of his mind by saying to himself, "Undine cannot be a fisherman's daughter. She is, in all probability, a native of some remote region and a member of some illustrious family." There was one thing, indeed, to which he had a strong aversion. This was to hear the old dame reproving Undine. The wild girl, it is true, commonly laughed at the reproof, making no attempt to conceal the extravagance of her mirth, but it appeared to him like touching his own honor. And still he found it impossible to blame the aged wife of the fisherman, since Undine always deserved at least 10 times as many reproofs as she received. So he continued to feel in his heart an affectionate tenderness for the ancient mistress of the house, and his whole life flowed on in the calm stream of contentment. There came, however, an interruption at last. The fisherman and the knight had been accustomed at dinner, and also in the evening when the wind roared without, as it rarely failed to do towards night, to enjoy together a flask of wine. But now their whole stock, which the fisherman had from time to time brought with him from the city, was at last exhausted, and they were both quite out of humor at the circumstance. That day Undine laughed at them excessively, but they were not disposed to join in her jest with the same gaiety as usual. Toward evening she went out of the cottage to escape, as she said, the sight of two such long and tiresome faces. While it was yet twilight, some appearances of a tempest seemed to be again mustering in the sky, and the waves already heaved and roared around them. The knight and the fisherman sprang to the door in terror to bring home the maiden, remembering the anguish of that night when Huldbrand had first entered the cottage. But Undine met them at the same moment, clapping her little hands in high glee. "What will you give me," she cried, "to provide you with wine? Or rather, you need not give me anything," she continued, "for I am already satisfied if you look more cheerful and are in better spirits than throughout this last most wearisome day. Only come with me. The forest stream has driven ashore a cask, and I will be condemned to sleep through a whole week if it is not a wine cask." The men followed her and actually found, in a bushy cove of the shore, a cask, which inspired them with as much joy as if they were sure it contained the generous old wine for which they were thirsting. They first of all, and with as much expedition as possible, rolled it toward the cottage, for heavy clouds were again rising in the west, and they could discern the waves of the lake in the fading light, lifting their white, foaming heads, as if looking out for the rain which threatened every instant to pour upon them. Undine helped the men as much as she was able, and as the shower, with a roar of wind, came suddenly sweeping on in rapid pursuit, she raised her finger with a merry menace toward the dark mass of clouds and cried, "Oh, you cloud, have a care, beware how you wet us. We are some way from shelter yet." The old man reproved her for this sally as a sinful presumption, but she laughed to herself softly, and no mischief came from her wild behavior. Nay, more, what was beyond their expectation, they reached their comfortable hearth unwet, with their prize secured. But the cask had hardly been broached, and proved to contain wine of a remarkably fine flavor, when the rain first poured down unrestrained from the black cloud. The tempest raved through the tops of the trees and swept far over the billows of the deep. Having immediately filled several bottles from the cask, which promised them a supply for a long time, they drew round the glowing hearth, and, comfortably secured from the tempest, they sat, tasting the flavor of their wine, and bandying jest. But the old fisherman suddenly became extremely grave, and he said, "Ah, great God! Here we sit rejoicing over this rich gift, which he to whom it first belonged, and from whom it was wrested by the fury of the stream, must there also, it is more than probable, have lost his life." "Oh, no such thing," said Undine, smiling as she filled the knight's cup to the brim. But he exclaimed, "By my unsullied honor, old father, if I knew where to find and rescue him, no fear of exposure to the night nor any peril should deter me from making the attempt. At least I can promise you that if I again reach an inhabited country, I will find out the owner of this wine or his heirs and make double and triple reimbursement." The old man was gratified with this assurance. He gave the knight a nod of approbation, and now drained his cup with an easier conscience and more relish. Undine, however, said to Huldbrand, "As to the repayment and your gold, you may do whatever you like. But what you said about your venturing out and searching and exposing yourself to danger appears to me far from wise. I should cry my very eyes out should you perish in such a wild attempt. And is it not true that you would prefer staying here with me and the good wine?" "Most assuredly," answered Huldbrand, smiling. "Well, then you see," replied Undine, "you spoke unwisely, for charity begins at home, and why need we trouble ourselves about our neighbors?" The mistress of the house turned away from her, sighing and shaking her head, while the fisherman forgot his wonted indulgence toward the graceful maiden, and thus rebuked her. "That sounds exactly as if you've been brought up by heathens and Turks." And he finished his reproof by adding, "May God forgive both you and me, unfeeling child." "Well, say what you will, that is what I think and feel," replied Undine. "Whoever brought me up, and all your talking cannot help it." "Silence!" exclaimed the fisherman in a voice of stern rebuke. And she, who with all her wild spirit was extremely alive to fear, shrank from him, moved close up to Huldbrand, trembling, and said very softly, "Are you also angry, dear friend?" The knight pressed her soft hand and tenderly stroked her locks. He was unable to utter a word, for his vexation, arising from the old man's severity towards Undine, closed his lips. And thus the two couples sat opposite to each other, at once heated with anger and in embarrassed silence. In the midst of this stillness, a low knocking at the door startled them all. For there are times when a slight circumstance, coming unexpectedly upon us, startles us like something supernatural. But there was the further source of alarm that the enchanted forest lay so near them, and that their place of abode seemed at present inaccessible to any human being. While they were looking upon one another in doubt, the knocking was again heard, accompanied with a deep groan. The knight sprang to seize his sword, but the old man said in a low whisper, "If it be what I fear it is, no weapon of yours can protect us." Undine, in the meanwhile, went to the door, and cried with the firm voice of fearless displeasure, "Spirits of the earth, if mischief be your aim, Culeborn shall teach you better manners." The terror of the rest was increased by this wild speech. They looked fearfully upon the girl, and Huldbrand was just recovering presence of mind enough to ask what she meant, when a voice reached them from without. "Oh, I am no spirit of earth, though a spirit still in its earthly body. You that are within the cottage there, if you fear God and would afford me assistance, open your door to me." By the time these words were spoken, Undine had already opened it, and the lamp throwing a strong light upon the stormy night, they perceived an aged priest without, who stepped back in terror when his eye fell on the unexpected sight of a little damsel of such exquisite beauty. Well might he think there must be magic in the wind and witchcraft at work, when a form of such surpassing loveliness appeared at the door of so humble a dwelling. So he lifted up his voice in prayer, "Let all good spirits praise the Lord God." "I am no spectre," said Undine with a smile. "Do I look so very frightful? And you see that I do not shrink from holy words. I, too, have knowledge of God, and understand the duty of praising Him. Everyone, to be sure, has his own way of doing this, for so He has created us. Come in, Father. You will find none but worthy people here." The holy man came bowing in and cast round a glance of scrutiny, wearing at the same time a very placid and venerable air. But water was dropping from every fold of his dark garments, from his long white beard and the white locks of his hair. The fisherman and the knight took him to another apartment and furnished him with a change of raiment, while they gave his own clothes to the women to dry. The aged stranger thanked them in a manner the most humble and courteous, but on the knight's offering him his splendid cloak to wrap round him, he could not be persuaded to take it, but chose instead an old gray coat that belonged to the fisherman. They then returned to the common apartment. The mistress of the house immediately offered her great chair to the priest, and continued urging it upon him till she saw him fairly in possession of it. "You are old and exhausted," said she, "and are moreover a man of God." Undine shoved under the stranger's feet her little stool, on which at all other times she used to sit near to Huldbrand, and showed herself most gentle and amiable towards the old man. Huldbrand whispered some raillery in her ear, but she replied gravely, "He is a minister of that being who created us all, and holy things are not to be treated with lightness." The knight and the fisherman now refreshed the priest with food and wine, and when he had somewhat recovered his strength and spirits, he began to relate how he had the day before set out from his cloister, which was situated far off beyond the great lake, in order to visit the bishop, and acquaint him with the distress into which the cloister and its tributary villages had fallen, owing to the extraordinary floods. After a long and wearisome wandering, on account of the rise of the waters, he had been this day compelled toward evening to procure the aid of a couple of boatmen, and cross over an arm of the lake which had burst its usual boundary. "But hardly," continued he, "had our small ferry-boat touched the waves when that furious tempest burst forth, which is still raging over our heads. It seemed as if the billows had been waiting our approach only to rush on us with a madness the more wild. The oars were wrested from the grasp of my men in an instant, and shivered by the resistless force, they drove farther and farther out before us upon the waves. Unable to direct our course, we yielded to the blind power of nature, and seemed to fly over the surges toward your distant shore, which we already saw looming through the mist and foam of the deep. Then it was at last that our boat turned short from its course, and rocked with a motion that became more wild and dizzy. I know not whether it was overset, or the violence of the motion threw me overboard. In my agony and struggle at the thought of near and terrible death, the waves bore me onward, till I was cast ashore here beneath the trees of your island." "Yes, an island!" cried the fisherman. "A short time ago it was only a point of land, but now, since the forest stream and lake have become all but mad, it appears to be entirely changed." "I observed something of it," replied the priest, "as I stole along the shore in obscurity, and hearing nothing around me but a sort of wild uproar, I perceived at last that the noise came from a point exactly where a beaten footpath disappeared. I now caught the light in your cottage and ventured hither, where I cannot sufficiently thank my heavenly Father, that, after preserving me from the waters, he has also conducted me to such pious people as you are. And the more so as it is difficult to say whether I shall ever behold any other persons in this world except you four." "What mean you by those words?" asked the fisherman. "Can you tell me, then, how long this will last?" replied the priest. "I am old. The stream of my life may easily sink into the ground and vanish before the overflowing of that fallish stream shall subside. And indeed it is not impossible that more and more of the foaming waves may rush in between you and yonder forest, until you are so far removed from the rest of the world that your small fishing canoe may be incapable of passing over, and the inhabitants of the continent entirely forget you in your old age, amid the dissipation and diversions of life." At this melancholy foreboding, the old lady shrank back with a feeling of alarm, crossed herself, and cried, "God forbid!" But the fisherman looked upon her with a smile and said, "What a strange being is man! Suppose the worst to happen. Our state would not be different. At any rate, your own would not, dear wife, from what it is at present. For have you these many years been farther from home than the border of the forest? And have you seen a single human being beside Undine and myself? It is now only a short time since the coming of the knight and the priest. They will remain with us, even if we do become a forgotten island. So after all, you will be the gainer." "I know not," replied the ancient dame. "It is a dismal thought, when brought fairly home to the mind, that we are forever separated from mankind, even though in fact we never do know nor see them." "Then you will remain with us? Then you will remain with us?" whispered Undine in a voice scarcely audible and half singing, while she nestled closer to Huldbrand's side. But he was immersed in the deep and strange musings of his own mind. The region on the farther side of the forest river seemed, since the last words of the priest, to have been withdrawing farther and farther in dim perspective from his view. And the blooming island on which he lived grew green and smiled more freshly in his fancy. His bride glowed like the fairest rose, not of this obscure nook only, but even of the whole wide world. And the priest was now present, added to which the mistress of the family was directing an angry glance at Undine, because even in the presence of the priest she leant so fondly on the knight, and it seemed as if she was on the point of breaking out in harsh reproof, then burst forth from the mouth of Huldbrand as he turned to the priest, "Father, you here see before you an affianced pair, and if this maiden and these good old people have no objection, you shall unite us this very evening." The aged couple were both exceedingly surprised. They had often, it is true, thought of this, but as yet they had never mentioned it, and now when the knight spoke it came upon them like something wholly new and unexpected. Undine became suddenly grave and looked down thoughtfully, while the priest made inquiries respecting the circumstances of their acquaintance, and asked the old people whether they gave their consent to the union. After a great number of questions and answers, the affair was arranged to the satisfaction of all, and the mistress of the house went to prepare the bridal apartment of the young couple, and also, with a view to grace the nuptial solemnity, to seek for 2 consecrated tapers which she had for a long time kept by her for this occasion. The knight in the meanwhile busied himself about his golden chain, for the purpose of disengaging 2 of its links that he might make an exchange of rings with his bride. But when she saw his object, she started from her trance of musing and exclaimed, "Not so! My parents by no means sent me into the world so perfectly destitute. On the contrary, they foresaw, even at that early period of life, that such a night as this would come." Thus speaking, she went out of the room, and a moment after returned with 2 costly rings, of which she gave one to her bridegroom and kept the other for herself. The old fisherman was beyond measure astonished at this, and his wife, who was just re-entering the room, was even more surprised than he, that neither of them had ever seen these jewels in the child's possession. "My parents," said Undine, "sewed these trinkets to that beautiful raiment which I wore the very day I came to you. They also charged me on no account whatever to mention them to anyone before my wedding evening. At the time of my coming, therefore, I took them off in secret and have kept them concealed to the present hour." The priest now cut short all further questioning and wondering, while he lighted the consecrated tapers, placed them on a table, and ordered the bridal pair to stand opposite to him. He then pronounced the few solemn words of the ceremony and made them one. The elder couple gave the younger their blessing, and the bride, gently trembling and thoughtful, leaned upon the knight. The priest then spoke out, "You are strange people, after all, for why did you tell me that you were the only inhabitants of the island? So far is this from being true, I have seen, the whole time I was performing the ceremony, a tall, stately man in a white mantle, standing opposite to me, looking in at the window. He must be still waiting before the door, if peradventure you would invite him to come in." "God forbid!" cried the old lady, shrinking back. The fisherman shook his head without opening his lips, and Huldbrand sprang to the window. It seemed to him that he could still discern a white streak, which soon disappeared in the gloom. He convinced the priest that he must have been mistaken in his impression, and they all sat down together round a bright and comfortable hearth. A few thoughts after Chapter 3. Pay special attention to water in this book. All 3 chapters have involved this primal element, this water. Chapter 3, as much as any other, it is, after all, floods and storms that brought the priest to the fisherman's cottage in the first place. Also, it was water that delivered the wine cask, that is. And it is floodwaters that have converted the peninsula into an island, marooning the 4 characters, now 5, counting the priest, wholly apart from mainland civilization. Consider also the uninvited guest at the marriage ceremony between Undine and Huldbrand. This alarming white figure looking in at the window. Yes, this strange white form has been present in every chapter so far, and is yet as great a mystery as ever. I hope you'll join us for the next installment, Chapter 4. Until then, press on, everybody.